The Allies are going to hop from island to island in the Pacific to try to recover islands that were lost to the Japanese early in the Pacific theater. And we've talked about a few. We talked about some things that were happening. So the subtopic today is the Allies go island hopping in the Pacific. Okay, what they're going to do is they're going to try to regain these islands to try to eliminate the Japanese control of both the Southwest and Central Pacific, because they've kind of dug in on those islands. Probably the most famous of those islands we'll get to later that you've heard of is the island of Iwo Jima. That's a big one, and we'll get to that in a minute. So on January 31st of 1944, the Allies captured the island of Kwajalein in the Pacific. On January 31st of 1944, the Allies captured the island of Kwajalein in the Pacific. And it was part of what we know as the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. It was one of several islands that make up the Marshall Islands. And this was a very important victory for the Allies to gain control of the entire Marshall Islands. So again, on January 31st of 1944, the Allies captured the island of Kwajalein in the Pacific. And capturing this island was very important because it helped them gain control of the entire group of Marshall Islands. Now, the reason they wanted Kwajalein is because they wanted the air bases there. And once they secured that island, they sent fleets of B-24 bombers to blast another island called Truk, which was a major Japanese stronghold in the Kwajalein Islands. So you can see that they're jumping from islands to islands, trying to gain control of this land that the Japanese had gained early in the Pacific. So from the bases, from the air bases at Kwajalein, the Allies sent fleets of B-24 bombers to blast the island of Truk, which was a major Japanese stronghold that was in the Kwajalein Islands. Now, if they could capture the Marshall Islands and the Kwajalein Islands, they would destroy Japanese control of the Southwest and Central Pacific Ocean. And it also would clear the way for who to return to the Philippines? General MacArthur. So there were some key reasons why the Marshall Islands and the Kwajalein Islands needed to be taken, is because it first of all would destroy Japanese control of the Southwest and Central Pacific, and it would also open the channel for General MacArthur to march back toward and recapture the Philippine Islands. Remember, he was forced to depart those islands early in the war and left General Jonathan Wainwright there and told him not to surrender. Unfortunately, they were forced to do so. Well, as General MacArthur is marching toward the Philippines, the Allies continue their pursuit, their island hopping in the Pacific, and they win 2 more victories in islands that were held by the Japanese, Guam and Saipan. Guam and Saipan. So what they're doing is they're just island hopping to take as many islands as they can to complete one of that 3-pronged strategy, because they're preparing themselves for what in the end? An invasion of Japan. So as General MacArthur is marching toward the Philippine Islands, the Allies continue their pursuit of Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Soon they win victories in 2 more Pacific islands that were once held by the Japanese, Guam and Saipan. And these victories are leaving Japanese forces isolated and helpless, and we are just going to continue to try to take islands. That's the idea. And we're eventually going to get to one called Iwo Jima, which we'll talk about in detail. Well, the next subtopic will be the victory in the Philippines. We'll talk about MacArthur's return. Victory in the Philippines. Now, think about the path we took. What path did the Allies take to get to the Philippines? What islands did we first have to capture by Australia? What islands? The Solomon Islands. And then we had to capture what? New Guinea. So, in October of 1944, those naval forces that fought at New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were joined by the troops that fought at Guam and Saipan, and they joined MacArthur on his pursuit of the Philippines. So in October of 1944, those naval forces moved up from the victories at New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. They would be joined by troops that served at both Guam and Saipan, and General MacArthur and these extra forces are going to converge upon the Philippine Islands to retake those. Okay, does that make sense? So he's building up force from New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Guam, and Saipan, and they're joining MacArthur. Those extra forces will first attack the beaches of Leyte, which is right in the center of the Philippine Islands. They attacked the beaches of Leyte, which was right in the center of the Philippine Islands. What city are they going to have to capture in the Philippines to really ensure that they recapture that area? The capital city of Manila. So again, in October of 1944, the vast naval forces moved up from victories at New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. They would be soon joined by the troops from both Guam and Saipan, and General MacArthur and these extra forces would converge upon Leyte, an island in the center of the Philippine Islands. They would take Leyte and then they would move on, and by early February of 1945, they would capture the Philippine capital of Manila. And when Manila fell to the Americans is when MacArthur made his famous return back. So early in February 1945, the Philippine capital of Manila fell to the Americans, and MacArthur now would make his famous return. What would the first thing they would do before MacArthur officially made his return? What would be the first thing they do in Manila? They would lower the Japanese flag, and they would put up two flags. They would put up an American flag, and what other flag? Whose country is it? The Filipino flag. So as American and Filipino flags are raised above the city of Manila, MacArthur makes his return and is quoted as saying, "I'm a little late, but we finally came. I'm a little late, but we finally came." So we're starting to group up some big victories in the Pacific. The Marshall Islands, right? What else? You tell me. What other group of islands? Caroline Islands, Guam, Saipan, the Philippines. Those are all important islands, which will lead us to the road to victory in the Pacific, which means we have to take the island of Iwo Jima. This is an incredibly important subtopic in American history. The road to victory in the Pacific, Iwo Jima. Why was it important? Because it was only 75 miles from where? Excuse me, 750 miles from where? Tokyo, Japan. So it'll be the closest we get to the capital of Japan. So on February 19th, 1945, February 19th, 1945, United States Marines landed on the beaches of Iwo Jima, which was an island just 750 miles from the Japanese capital of Tokyo. On February 19th, 1945, the United States Marines landed on the beaches of Iwo Jima, which was just 750 miles from Tokyo, Japan. Now, did you guys know there was more than one D-Day in World War II? We had D-Day in Europe, which happened on the beaches of, and we have D-Day in the Pacific, which happened on the beaches of Iwo Jima. And it was very similar to what you saw on that excerpt from Saving Private Ryan. the Marines are going to take the beaches of Iwo Jima in a very similar manner, okay? Only it would be much more brutal than Normandy, worse than Normandy. The fighting on this little tiny island of Iwo Jima would be the bloodiest fight in Marine Corps history. It would be the bloodiest fight in Marine Corps history. Bloodiest fight in Marine Corps history. By the time this island is secured, 7,000 Marines will be killed and an additional 20,000 wounded. In this battle at Iwo Jima, it'll take the lives of nearly 7,000 American Marines and leave an additional 20,000 wounded. 7,000 killed, 20,000 wounded. Now, why do we want Iwo Jima? Because we want the airfields to bomb which country? Japan. It's crucial we have this. We've got to have Iwo Jima if we're going to have the important airfields for the invasion of the homeland of Japan. Crucial we have Iwo Jima. Now, as the Germans were in Normandy, only more fortified, the Japanese were dug in very deep along the island in bunkers. And they had tunnels that were going from one bunker to another. Unbelievable maze in the mountains that had a tremendous defense area set up for attack. Now, what do you always want? We talked about this in the Civil War, especially at Gettysburg. What do you want in a battle? The high ground. And the Japanese had the high ground. From high points on the island, the Japanese fired machine guns and launched bombs at the incoming landing crafts that were taking those Marines to the beaches. Just very similar to what you saw on the video I showed you on Saving Private Ryan. Those landing crafts and amphibious tanks were trying to get on the beach with those soldiers. Again, they were dropping the front. Those soldiers were rushing the beaches of Iwo Jima. Very, very similar. They estimated that 70,000 American soldiers would be fighting in this battle for this island against approximately 22,000 Japanese. 70,000 American soldiers, most of them belonging to what? The United States Marine Corps. 70,000 Americans against 22,000 Japanese. A big majority of those 70,000 American Marines were too young to vote or too young to drink alcohol at the time legally. They were too young to vote and too young to drink alcohol. And that's going to lead during the Vietnam conflict to a change in a constitutional amendment on the voting age. Because people's feelings were you should be able to vote for your president if you're going to fight for your country. But at that time, most of those Marines that fought at Iwo Jima were too young to either vote or drink alcohol. It was estimated that an American Marine was struck down roughly every 30 seconds during the initial storming of the beaches of Iwo Jima. It was estimated that an American Marine was struck down roughly every 30 seconds during the initial storming of the beaches of Iwo Jima. How many were killed total? About 7,000, right? They estimated that at the end of the first day, and this was many days of fighting, probably 2,000 Marines were killed or wounded the first day. 2,000 Marines were either killed or wounded the first day. Now, Iwo Jima was 8 square miles. That's what the island was, 8 square miles. You know what that means? What's 8 square miles? 8 by 8 by 8 by 8. Okay, is that right? What's 8 square miles? Could be. Yeah, very small. Now, at the top of Iwo Jima was a dormant volcano known as Mount Suribachi. The top of the 8 square mile island of Iwo Jima was a dormant volcano known as Mount Suribachi. On February 24th, 1945, which would be the 5th day of the battle, this wasn't a short battle, the 5th day of the battle, the decision was made that that high ground must be taken. Mount Suribachi must be taken for the Allies to be successful in taking Iwo Jima. So on February 24th, 1945, which was the 5th day of the battle, the decision from the high brass stated that the high ground must be taken, and that high ground included Mount Suribachi. Now this is where we get into some detail that leads to our famous picture. I think I gave you, didn't I give you a handout with that on it? So, when the decision was made that Mount Suribachi must be taken, 40 Marines from Easy Company were ordered to climb to the top to seize control of that high ground. 40 Marines from Easy Company were ordered to climb to the top of Mount Suribachi to seize control of the high ground. 40 Marines from Easy Company were ordered to climb to the top of Mount Suribachi and seize control of that high ground. They took an American flag with them, these Marines did. And they were going to raise it if they made it to the top and gained control. There was no guarantee at all. So these 40 Marines from Easy Company take off. Their mission is to seize control of Mount Suribachi, or the high ground. They take an American flag with them to raise if they make it to the top of Mount Suribachi. They made it to the top. They took control of the summit, and they raised the American flag. And this would be the first time that the Stars and Stripes ever flew over Japanese soil. Was it Japanese soil in the Philippines? It was not. But it is at Iwo Jima. Now, this is where people get confused and they think what they are seeing is the raising of the flag at Mount Suribachi. That was the first flag raising. Okay? Photos were taken of this first flag raising, but it was not the famous one. Because once the Marine brass heard of the initial flag raising, they made a historic decision. Commanders wanted a bigger flag taken up to Mount Suribachi so it could be seen from farther away. So I don't know how many of you knew this, but there were 2 flag raisings at Mount Suribachi. The second will result in the famous photograph that we will soon talk about. So after seeing the flag waving from above, from the initial flag raising, the Marine brass made a historic decision. Commanders wanted a bigger flag displayed so it would rally the troops and could be seen from farther away. Okay, really gets good. So a Marine private first class by the name of Rene Gagnon was ordered to take this larger flag to the summit. Did he take a bunch of people with him? No. They had gained control of the summit, but was it still dangerous to get up there? Yes. He actually took 2 people with him, neither one armed. What were they? One was a photographer and one was a cameraman. What's the difference between a photographer at the time and a cameraman? One took still photos, the other took video, believe it or not. So who he took with him was Associated Press photographer Joseph Rosenthal and military cameraman Staff Sergeant Bill Gunhoust. Bill Gunhoust. So along with Gagnon, 2 important photographers scaled the summit of Mount Iwo Jima at Mount Suribachi. AP Press photographer, Associated Press photographer Joseph Rosenthal, and military cameraman Staff Sergeant Bill Gunhoust. Kids, it was then, once on top of Mount Suribachi, that Joseph Rosenthal takes his very famous photograph of the second flag raising as Bill Gunhoust records it with his movie camera. So there were 2 flag raisings at Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. And obviously this picture here is the one that became incredibly famous. But it again was the second flag rising, not the first, and it's going to make a difference in a minute. Finishing the battle. After these photographs, fighting continued on that island with the worst yet to come. So a lot of people think when that flag went up at Mount Suribachi, the whole thing was over. Actually, the worst was yet to come. They had simply gained control of the high ground. The battle would last another, kids, 31 days. 31 days before victory could be claimed by the United States. So after these photographs were taken of the first and second flag raising, fighting continued on the island, with the worst would be yet to come for the American Marines, as the battle would last another 31 days before victory could be claimed by the United States. Meanwhile, Joseph Rosenthal's film was sent to nearby Guam to be developed. Did he take the picture of the first flag raising? No, he did not. Okay? So meanwhile, Joe Rosenthal's film was sent to a nearby island, Guam, to be developed. And then where was it sent from there? Where do you think? So someone important could see it. It was sent back to the United States, where President Roosevelt viewed it for the first time. That famous photograph of the Marines lifting the flag at Mount Suribachi. What do you think the president wants as soon as he sees the photograph? What's that? No, we're going to get to that way later. What? He wants those, first of all, he wants those 6 soldiers identified.